Hi everyone, my name is Marie Drake and I'm a quality engineering manager here in Zoopla. And for today, we actually have a really interesting session that we want to share to everyone. And this is about testing and story shaping. So the main reason why myself and Callum decided to do this recording is there's been a few questions from the QE community as to what kind of resources are out there so that we can help testers be better in doing story shaping. And while there's a lot of articles, out there, we felt that there's not a lot of resources around, videos or something that, the community can watch. So we've decided then that why not create our own resource that we can share to everyone. So I'm hoping that this session will be useful. We'll talk about what is story shaping, why is it important, and then Callum will talk about what do we do as a tester. What do we actually do in these story shaping sessions? What are the questions that we need to ask, and then the risks that we need to uncover? And then we'll actually do an example story shaping session so that at least you know how to implement this into your own different teams. So I'll hand over to Callum for a quick introduction.
Thanks, Marie. So I'm Callum Ryan. I'm a senior tester, and I do a lot of blogging at Callum Ryan's testing blog. And I've also been talking both externally to the community, but also internally to my company about writing ACs and also how we can help push our testing left to improve testing early. But as Marie said, there's not a lot of resources out there for how we do that. There's a lot of like, we should do that, which is great, but the how to do it is what's missing. So hopefully we'll get to some of that now for you. Cool. Thank you, Marie.
Mhm. So just to start this session, first I would like to talk about what story shaping is, and some of you might know it as story shaping, the power of three, or three amigos, as most of you know, or Triforce, which I believe is a coined is a term that's been coined by Callum. So these sessions are basically used to refine and create the user stories to provide a shared and complete understanding of what it is that we're going to build as a team. So the session itself doesn't need to be just one session, or it doesn't have to be like a really long session. In the past, both myself and Callum, we have experience of just running it for like 15 minutes after stand up, or you can even do it like asynchronous, so whatever really works best with you and your team. The end goal really is at the end of the session, everyone should have that same understanding, so we're all on the same page as to what needs to be tested and what needs to be developed. So, Triforce, or story shaping, is not the time for bringing everybody along for the journey of what we're doing. So that usually happens in sprint kickoff, like ceremonies where the tickets have been refined as part of the Triforce session. It's also not the time to talk about potential solutions. So we're just interested in making sure that the tickets have acceptance criteria, that they are clear, and that we're ready to bring it into the next sprint. So why do we need to shape stories? And the short answer is basically we need to be ready to start development. We need to make sure that from a testing point of view, we know what we are also testing. So we need to know what we're working towards and have the same view of the business needs before we can start working on them. So if we don't drive out this good acceptance criteria, then we could run into a lot of risks. So we'll also talk about the different types of risks that we can uncover later as part of this session, but just some example of the risks that we can like run into. So for example, scope creep from not knowing what we're building, or how far to or how f- or how far to go. We don't want to build the wrong thing because we've misinterpreted the task, and we don't really want to waste everyone's time and effort. We don't want to slow down our team velocity because we don't have enough information to get started. And because of this like slowness in the velocity, the feedback essentially on what we've built is coming into like a late stage. That also contributes to having, poor quality of what we've built because we haven't really considered what could go wrong for our end users. And lastly, one of the risks that we, can essentially run into if we don't do a really good acceptance criteria is, we could test the wrong thing. And that's really something that we need to, make sure at an earlier stage. So as software testers, helping to refine acceptance criteria, it allows us to explore and apply critical analysis to features and functionality before any code has been written. So what this means is we can also identify problems before they occur, and we can build the fixes into the development code upfront rather than having to raise bugs. So, who is involved with this session? So, story shaping, it's pretty much a collaboration between three different perspectives. So, you have the product, and from the product perspective, they basically provide context on business requirements, on the user needs. So, typically, you have a representative, for example, you have a product owner or you have product designers. You also have a perspective coming from the development team. So they normally provide context on the technical implementation details and what is possible in terms of like the different sort of like a technical implementation that we're going to like try to like approach. And finally, we need to consider a perspective from the testing point of view. So from this perspective, we tend to, ensure that the tickets are testable and they are ready for development by ensuring that all thoughts, all areas a covered. So the try and try for in the try and try force, not trifle. It doesn't refer to the number of people in a session. So um just because the word try is in there doesn't mean that it's actually, that we just need, three people. So it actually refers to the number of, perspectives or, hats that should be represented in a session. Given as well that there may be people with different amounts of domain knowledge. There could be, people with front end or, back end expertise. It's very likely that more than one person will need to represent that perspective. I'll pass over now to Callum, so he'll talk about the next couple of slides.
So, as a tester in your story shaping or your Triforce, your Power of Three, we're there to help build the quality in early. And the way that we can do that is by asking some really easy questions up front. We can start with, is this testable? So we need to make sure that our acceptance criteria, that our tickets are written in a way that we can clearly say, we've done this, or that we can create automation pass fail scripts for. We need to make sure that things are not ill-defined or very loosely defined, because that's not testable. If somebody comes along and say, this is performant, what does that mean? Performant is a very loose terminology. So we want to say something more akin to this should respond within this many seconds, because we can actually pass or fail that. So we need to be questioning to say, is it testable to do that? So we can question anything that's open to interpretation. I like to say you don't want me as a tester to define what good looks like for this, because I will go to the nth degree and test out everything for this. So that's a good way to sort of get your product owner sort of thinking about these things. We will talk about what good acceptance criteria look like in a couple of slides. So I will go into that a bit more. We need to be asking what could go wrong. So the other people in the story shaping or the Triforce are likely to just focus on the happy path. They're going to be engineers or business people. So we need to tease out what negative and edge cases might be so that we can write and plan for what should happen. So start thinking about what could go wrong, how could users use this? And that will push our testing early, preventing bugs being written into the code up front. And that shortens our feedback loops for quality, which is always good, stops us having to rework things. And we'll talk about that risk analysis later on. And then we also need to identify, do we all understand what is meant? We can we can ensure the quality of our stories by making sure everyone in the team could pick it up and know what's to be done. That means working out any assumptions and getting them documented, making sure that business and developers' needs are universally understood so we don't have to go back and ask about these things. And it means cutting out any jargon or any assumptions that are in people's heads and making sure that we can do things in that way. When I say do things, I mean make sure that everyone could pick something up that it's ready to work on. Just a note on this is that we should not be being the business analyst in this meeting. We should be helping to test ideas and come up with new ACs based on risk and helping the product owner to drive out the ask of the story. We shouldn't be there thrashing out things just because we know what's testable or what good looks like. Doesn't mean we're writing that down. We're helping. So I said about things should be testable, and we should talk about what makes a good acceptance criteria in order to drive out testability. We said that we should have a clear pass-fail result. Things should be written in a way to detail what should be present to a user for it to be met, and they should be measurable rather than indistinct. I don't want it to be like usable. I want to say, right, here's how it could be usable. It needs to meet AA standards of accessibility, or these types of user profiles should be able to use it. We should also focus on the end result and not the solution. So this is in green here, the what and not the how. People love to drive straight in to solutionizing something. But how do we know we're building the right thing unless we have context as to what we want to do? So we want to drive out the what. One of the most powerful things you can ask as a tester when you're doing story shaping is to say, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? If you add implementation details to your tickets too early, you're going to bias development and influence your testing because you'll just think there's one way of doing things and you're not allowing yourself to, come up with the best solution for something. So again, really focus on that what and not the how. We need to make sure that we cover off happy, negative, and edge cases. I've talked about this already, but we need to make sure if things fail over, what should happen? It shouldn't be a shock to us that things are going to fail over. So error handling, if we want to say in our network environment, how things might fail, things like that, we need to consider those and write them in up front. And similarly, we should include our non-functional test criteria as well. So we need to think about where this is appropriate. It might not be always the case, but we want to think about things like performance, security, usability, readability, understandability, accessibility, all of the ilities, and start to document those. So we can help the team to identify needs of the systems. Ask, if lots of people use this endpoint, will we DDoS ourselves? Do we need to put in something for that? How quickly does this endpoint need to respond to us? Or how secure does it need to be? Point out that these might not be needed right now. So capture them for later if you don't need them right now, say if you're in like a technical demonstrator sort of space, but do make sure that you do talk about them where it's useful to. And also remember to make them specific and testable as well. We need to make sure that acceptance criteria are independently testable as well and independent from each other. So one acceptance criteria, one requirement, one thing. So we don't want to be saying like, oh, this should be performant and have a text box and you can put data into it. It's too much all at once. How do I know that I'm building the right thing? Just split them out. Just makes it a lot easier. And also you can really clearly say, this has failed. This is the acceptance criteria. This is the part of the story that has failed. So really help the team to break down any overly verbose ACs. And that will help shape people's brains thinking about what are all the things that need to be here as well. And finally, they need to be clearly written. Like, don't use jargon. I think I mentioned that before. Use something like Monzo's tone of voice to make sure that things are written in just a human language. I've tend to found that a lot of product owners try to write things in very businessy terminology, or they try to get too technical. Don't worry about that. Just tell me what the user needs to be able to do. If it's they just need to be able to log in, Just say the user just needs to be able to log in. I don't need them to say, oh, they should be able to interface with the UI to access. Don't worry about that. Just clearly tell me this is what I need to be able to do. And also as a tester, we want to be able to talk about what could go wrong. And we've talked about that a lot to say, like, where could the errors live? How could this fail over? But within that, we need to be pragmatic. Testing is infinite, especially exploratory testing, which is what this effectively is. So we're going to come up with so many risks, but we need to focus on the ones that actually matter right now. And you could say, is this a demo? Is this a patchable product? Is this going live? And having that view of like how good this needs to be could tell you like what risks I need to focus on. Because if you raise too many things too quickly, it's going to alienate you from the team. You're not going to be seen as a team player or pulling in the right direction if you're like trying to create 50,000 ACs for every possible solution or every possible thing that could go wrong. You want to be, as a tester, that trusted advisor, raising the issues that are actually going to be worked upon. So also remember that because people just want to get going onto the solution of things or the implementation of things, if you test it too much, people are going to switch off a bit or get uncomfortable. So really try to find that sweet spot of like, here are the things that matter right now. And the way that you can do that is to set out your expectations of pragmatism really early on in your test approach via a blanket statement of things like, do we need to cover NFRs, non-functional requirements? How deep are we going to look? Or maybe just like talking to your team up front, set out your stall and say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, in story shaping, test the ideas. I'll go this deep. Or if we think we're getting too deep and we don't care, let me know, because then you can collaborate. Another thing you can do with risks and thinking about what could go wrong is you could do your thinking up front. Most of the time, the dirty secret is you're going to be developing something that's similar to something else. It's going to be a service. There's going to be data flowing through it. There might be a front end or an interaction. There might be a persistence sort of thing. Because you know this, think about the risks early. And you can create heuristics. You can create a cheat sheet of possible risks or a mind map of things. If you're thinking of data, you could think, what's too big? What's too small? What happens if it falls over partway through? Does it fall over to another data source? And you can share those with yourself and the other testers and get a huge list of cool risks up front that you can come prepared to the meeting with and look really awesome when you come and say, oh, I've had a think. Here are all the things that could go wrong. Do we need to consider any of these for our story? And finally, when we're thinking about what could go wrong, we need to think about the product in the real world as well. So think about your users. We can ask who that person is during story shaping. So this could be like, as a user, like, don't just leave it to as a user or as a developer. Think, who is this person? What are they trying to do? Because that's going to drive out possible risks. This could be like, as a person trying to buy a washing machine. Cool. Now we know it's like an actual person. They're trying to shop. They've got a specific need. Are they upset because they can't wash their clothes? Are they somebody who is drunk? Are they sleepy? Do they have a crying baby? Because that's going to really make you think about how things will be used in the real world as well. Also think about the environment of usage. So think about your network, your hardware specs, how these can fail, your input controls for things, and also how it could be deployed as well. And so that will talk about your configuring and what will need to be set up. So just as a brief heads up, just to talk a bit about those things for some do's and don'ts, we talked about run short sessions for story shaping and do that frequently. Do make sure the ticket is prepared. Don't try and write your acceptance criteria or your story coming into it. We're here to refine the story rather than to write it from scratch. As a tester, define what good enough looks like or how pragmatic you need to be with your risks early, because that way you can be that trusted advisor and give the right level of information. And make sure to look beyond just the happy path and start teasing out those risks. And the don'ts are, don't just focus on the how and the implementation. Don't invite everyone. This is the time just to flesh out those stories and get it documented. It's not the time to bring everyone on the journey. Don't stay quiet. You're the tester. You're there to help drive out what quality looks like for this. So don't sit there quietly. do speak up, do try to be involved where possible. And also, don't make assumptions that people know what is meant by things, because then failure can come. So do make sure that you challenge any assumptions that are being had. So let's think about some example questions that you can ask. So what happens on error? Pretty evident. If things fall over, or if things fail, should they respond gracefully? Should there be a UI prompt? What should that look like? What happens if the network or the hardware fails? So not just an error when it comes to the software or the inputs, but what actually happens if the network cuts out? Do we persist anything? Do we, I can't remember what it's called. Uh, uh, do we save responsively, and so on? I had a point, but I forgot what it was. um, and also, what does this have to work with? Think about your integration points and ask those questions. Does this have to work downstream? Do we have any things that need to interact with this? And how might that data work? What compatibility issues are there, not just with other software, but with hardware, mobile, networks, all these types of things. So think about your compatibility, browsers even. I once had an AC to say this had to render on the PlayStation browser for PS3s, which we thought was deprecated, but it turns out it wasn't. Talk about your non-functional requirements. So how performant does this need to be? How quickly do I need a response? And also, if you think about how accessible does this need to be to people? Are there any requirements that we have around that? Also think about, could you test this? For everything that's being written, how would I test this? Do I actually understand what a pass or a fail would be? If somebody says, oh yeah, it needs to be accessible, how do I know what that looks like? So how could I test for that? Think and ask, does everyone understand this? Has any assumptions been made? Also think about, how supportable is this? Do we need logging? If this fails in the field, how do we know that it's failed, and how do we fix these things? Ask that, because there might be requirements to say, either for a user to fix it themselves by having error handling messages, or we need logging on our services, especially at the back end, to say, all right, this has fallen over because of this reason. And finally, we're not in a vacuum. We can ask if anyone else sees any risks too. We test as champion quality, but we're not the only ones that can see risk. So ask about that business perspective, and ask the developers from their engineering perspective to say, I'm coming up with ideas. Are there anything that you can see that we need to be considerate of as well? Oh, I think, yeah.
So I think risk is a very big, factor that we need to focus on in terms of story shaping. So there's actually different types of risks that you can try to uncover. So the first one, for example, is product level risk. And this is why in story shaping or in Triforce, it's important to have those different representatives, because from a product perspective, we need to talk about what are the risks that are applicable to this product level. So, for example, is your feature, or is the work that you're going to do, is it going to affect multiple teams? That needs to be discussed earlier on. So if you're doing a story about data migration, are other teams aware of the impact? So this needs to be fleshed out as early as possible, and you can do this in story shaping. Another example is around if we're talking about, some hard deadlines for this work that can impact like the overall quality of the product. So we need to talk about, this risk earlier on. Are there any regulations or, compliance that we need to follow? So again, this all needs to be discussed. um, there's also the solution level risks. So this are risks that apply to, the technical work, or to the to the actual implementation details on our feature. So an example risk that you can try to flesh out earlier on is, does everyone in your team have all the necessary skill set to implement this feature? I think programming language as well of choice, the different tools. I know we shouldn't focus much on the how, but again, just raise that question initially, that Have we decided to go into this route? Do we actually have, people who know how to program or how to use this tool? If we're going for open source libraries or third party solutions, it's also good to discuss those earlier on, because that can address some of the solution level risks that you might have. You can also start talking about the feature level risks. So these are risks that are applicable to the actual feature level. So think about the risks that can impact the functionality that you'll actually provide to your users. So as a tester, you can ask the questions like, is the feature actually what the users expect? How can we get the user feedback earlier on to mitigate all these different feature risks? Again, think about, if you're developing a new feature, so are there any existing features that might be impacted by this new feature? Because if this new feature is quite connected to existing like features, then you might want to raise that, oh, we need to be careful about doing some changes in this area. And if there are going to be impacts, and then we need to make sure that we have some regression testing in place to make sure that the existing features aren't as impacted. Story level risks, they are quite similar to feature level, but it's actually on the story level. So if we think about the actual like story, we just break down the different like user flows that we have identified in the feature level journey as like individual stories. So the same sort of questions really apply to story level. And then finally, you have task level risks. So task level for me, it's so if you're talking about like what are the specific tasks that you need to do in terms of achieving a particular feature, this also needs to be fleshed out. So an example question can be, does the person who's working on this ticket, do they have all they need from a technical level to implement this task? Is this task actually going to achieve the story or feature goal? So Callum talked about like scope creep, a while ago. So that's something that we really want to avoid. So as much as possible, each of the tasks should be like targeted to achieve the actual story or feature. So you've done the story shaping session. What actually happens, afterward? So if there are any changes that needs to be updated, so the ticket should actually be updated with any changes. So you can't just do the session and then if there's a change in requirement, just go go for a tea or like coffee after, and then you actually forgot to update the ticket. So please make sure that you update the ticket with any changes, so at least everything is recorded. And then after that, the tickets can then be talked through in sprint planning or backlog refinement. So what we normally do in our team is, after we've done the story shaping, we then involve the rest of the team. At least they have a clear idea as to what we've discussed as part of the ticket, and then we just point the ticket in terms of like the complexity, and then we then bring it into our sprint planning for the next sprint. This is also related to what I said. So once the tickets are actually clear, then it's in a very good shape to be actually estimated and planned. So it just makes the whole like work cycle much easier for the rest of the team.
So I wrote a story, and we're going to now have a look at it as testers, to go through and actually, just give a bit of an example of what we could do as testers to help shape a story a bit better. So this is a quite a basic story. Given a logged out user, when I navigate to the login page, then I should be able to enter my login details and submit them. We've got 3 acceptance criteria here. The user can enter an email address and password. User can see a submit button. And when a password is valid, it takes the user to the home page. So Marie and I are just going to talk through and just give out some of the questions that we might ask, just to give it a flavor of how this would look as testers. And I guess I'm happy to start
Yep.
to say that first acceptance criteria, we've got enter an email address and a password, it would be good to split those into two. So we'd have one to say, okay, I can enter an email address and I can enter a password as well. Um, I'd also say from that, cool. What characters can we allow from that as well? So making assumptions that they can enter an email address. Do we want special characters? How long does it want to be? And especially for passwords as well, we want those to be strong. So what kind of characters, what regexes do we want to allow for these types of things?
Mm-hmm.
I can see we've got see a submit button. That's very much the how rather than the what. So I guess what we really mean there is that the user can submit their email address and their password. And we probably want to just make sure that we focus on behavior that they can do. Um, is that just via submitting their email address and password? Are there any other mechanisms as well? This might be a mobile application. Is there face recognition? Should they be able to save their email address and password? Should there be like a little tick box to say, remember me is something as well? Do we want that? And we also talk about valid passwords, users going to the home page. What if they enter something wrong? What if they enter something invalid? What security considerations do we have around that as well? Because maybe in the API or in the actual error messages, it might say, oh, this is not actually a user. Well, suddenly we've identified a way of finding out what users do exist or what email addresses do exist within the backend. So that's definitely something. And how do we want to, or sorry, do we want to show like a UI representation of you've entered invalid details, try again. What if I've forgotten my password? Should there be something for that? And how quickly should I be able to get a response to this as well? Does that matter? Do we want like a 10-second response time? We should also think about things like, are there users who might deprecate? So it might be a password that's valid, but maybe we want a way of saying, well, actually, this user's deprecated now, and we don't want that anymore. And what happens if they refresh their page? Is that something where they always have to sign in? Is this just in certain situations as well? That was a lot of things up front. Any from you?
Yeah, so you basically discussed some of the things that I would, initially look out for, but um I think one of the key things as well that, is really important is, say for example, when a user refreshes the page, what happens? Do we just redirect them, to the homepage, or is there like a mechanism wherein if they refresh and they have been idle, for quite some time, do they get to see the login page again? In terms of the like validation, so what happens as well if there are like trailing spaces in usernames and, in your passwords or in your email address even? So I've definitely been on a situation when I was trying to sign in, and I definitely type the right combination, but it just wouldn't let me, sign in. And that could probably be I entered an additional, space at the end. So there should be a mechanism in place to actually just remove the trailing spaces, so it's not as like frustrated, from the user's point of view. And as users, we tend to be, like impatient creatures. So what happens if I click, the back button multiple times? Or what if I try to click the submit, like more than once? What's gonna happen? So this sort of like different like edge cases scenarios need to be discussed, because there might be some risks that, might exist in those scenarios. And if we're talking about from the non-functional requirements, from an accessibility point of view, how will this work if I don't just use my mouse? So if I just use the keyboard, if I just use my tab key to actually enter, my email address and password, and if it's a button, and if I just enter like my enter key, will it actually redirect me to the homepage? And in terms of the actual like indicators, every time that we try to tab to the different fields, are we going to show some indication that, the user is on that specific field, just so that it's easier from an accessibility point of view? Things like, the color contrast as well. So this is something that, again, if we're talking about how to incorporate accessibility requirements earlier on, that is something that we can also flesh out as part of this acceptance criteria. And what happens if the network fails, like what Callum had discussed a while ago. So say, for example, there is an issue with the server when the user is trying to log in. Are we going to show a like a, I don't know, like a 500 internal server error page? Like, what will we actually display on the front end so that the user knows that there's actually some like server side, issue that happens? The last thing that I can think of, again, is from a security, point of view. When a user is, logged in, and if there are any like sensitive information. So if I try to, let's say, open my developer tool. So if I'm using a Chrome browser, if I try to just look at my session, look at my cookies, I shouldn't be able to see my password. So it should be encrypted, so that it's, actually secure in terms of that specific requirement. So as you can see from discussion, there's, quite a few areas that, we've actually talked about. So
I've even got more that I just thought of whilst you were doing that as
sure.
well. I I I,
Yeah.
I considered, like, you talked about the network being down, but what if
Yeah.
the services fail?
Yes.
As well. And what if there's like network stutter or slow running network?
So
Like, what
yeah.
if there's packet loss?
Yeah.
What would happen then? I also thought about concurrency of users. Like, can we DDoS
How
this
many?
service?
Yeah.
How many people we're expecting to use that? And then these are entry fields, right? How secure do we need to be? What about
Yeah.
injection attacks?
Injection
And,
attack.
and
Yeah.
yeah. I also thought about browsers and compatibility. What do we need to support? Does this need to look good
Mhm.
on IE, on PlayStation, on mobile browsers, on Safari? And if we are using mobile browsers, does this need to work with the mobile keyboard? Does this need to work
Mhm.
with touch screens?
Mhm.
And also, what languages do we need to support? Have we just made an
Yeah.
assumption that this is UK English?
Okay. Yeah.
Do we have other sites that we need to support as well? And what
Yeah.
does that need to look like? So,
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I stopped your head of steam there as you were wrapping
Yeah.
up, but you can see, like, as you
This
start to think about risks, they all start to pull out.
Yeah. So, and this is why having story shaping or having, Triforce is really important, because the last point that you said about what language, like that is, um, if I remember, it's an implicit requirement, but it's something that, I remember this from Nicholas like session. And yeah, it's this implicit requirements that we just really need to flesh out, because it seems that, okay, it's expected that it needs to be developed, or it needs to be it needs to behave in that way, but we need to be, also like we need to ensure that everyone is actually on the same page about that, because it could be that my expectation is different from what your expectation, and this is what the whole story shaping session is about.
And what should be really evident when we were trying that as well is that these are basically test ideas. What
Mm-hmm.
we've talked about, the things that we're writing as acceptance criteria, is we're doing our exploration. We're basically presenting the team with our test ideas for this up front. We don't want to trick our teams. We're not going, haha, I thought of this idea and you didn't. We're
Yeah.
sharing that early so that they can fix it early and it's not a bug. So think of it as, when you come to test something, what would you test? What
Mm-hmm.
would you do with it? And use that to then start going, okay, how should this behave when these things
Mm-hmm.
happen?
Yeah.
So that's the way that I've come about doing that as well.
Yeah. And this is where having or adopting different personas can really help. So if we want to incorporate accessibility requirements earlier on, you really have to put on, that hat on, how you can actually just use a website without using your mouse, like by actually thinking from a perspective that, that person has a disability. So having different personas can actually really help.
Well, I hope this was useful to everyone. Hopefully, it's given you some ideas and some good examples for how we get involved more in story shaping as a tester, thinking about how to drive out better acceptance criteria.
Yeah.
So, yeah, hopefully, everyone, really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess if there's any feedback, cuz like we've just done this in like one sort of like recording. So if there's any feedback, for us, that would be great. You could reach out to me via Twitter. I'm on Twitter at mcruisedrake, and Callum, you can also plug your Twitter handle, or
Yeah.
whichever way people would like to connect with you.
Yeah, and you can get me on Twitter at C8KirstRyan.
Nice one. Cool. Well, yeah, I hope everyone found this session useful. I definitely have, and yeah, um I I hope this was useful basically.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.